have the chair tonight, and I'm looking forward enormously, as I am sure you all are, to a wonderful discussion presented first, of course, by the auditor and then replied to by Cody Keenan, Mr. Rowan Montgomery. My first duty is to ask the Treasurer to read the minutes of the last inaugural meeting of the Society.
The last inaugural meeting of the College Historical Society was held on Tuesday, the 12th of April 2022. The author of the 252nd session, Margaret Larson, gave her address on truth. She spoke about the importance of valuing truth and authenticity as a debater and as an orator, values which were effectively emulated by Margaret Atwood during her address of the Society during its 250th session. Silver medals were awarded to Martha McKinney Perry and Julie Nan. These medals recognise their outstanding contributions to the debates of society and their exceptional skill in oratory, which they demonstrated during its 251st session. There were two motions passed. The first was the thanks of the Society, which were due to the auditor for their paper. This motion was proposed by Anya Kennedy, the Equity Officer of the 252nd session. This motion was subsequently put to the floor by the Chair and passed. The second motion was that the College Historical Society is worthy of support. This motion was proposed by Julie Nan, Treasurer of the 251st section and Honorary Member. It was also put to the floor by the Chair and passed.
Since these are the minutes of the last meeting, I have to ask you, is it your wish that I should sign them as an accurate record of the last inaugural meeting? Would you say aye?
Aye.
May I sign them? Yes. I will sign them. And, okay. And now I would like to ask the Treasurer to perform her second duty of the evening, which is to present the awards to the members of the Society.
It is my distinct honour to be awarding two trophies to two new members of the Society for exceptional achievements this session. The first award I would like to present is the Rosaline Mills Maidens Trophy, named after the very first woman to address the Society in 1969 during our 199th session. This year, the competition was sponsored by Deloitte, to whom we are exceptionally grateful to, and we would also like to give special thanks to our Record Secretary, Molly Carroll, who can't be here this evening, for her incredible efforts in convening the competition. And now I would like to call on our winner, Athena Wu, as the Rosaline Mills Maiden Final Champion 2022. I am thrilled to also announce the winner of our Freshers Masters Competition 2023. We would like to express the Society's sincerest gratitude to DLA Piper for partnering with us on this competition, and thank you to our entire debates convener department, including Daniela Williams, Mary Woods, Anna Suika, and Tom Francis, for putting together such a wonderful competition. It is my honour to announce that Katie Harrington is the winner of the Freshers Masters Competition 2023. Floor back to the Chair.
And now we move to the address of the Auditor. It's an enormous pleasure for me to invite the Auditor to give his address on the importance of discourse in the modern day. Auditor.
I would say that there are two seriously important things that I've learned during my time in college, perhaps slightly to the dismay of my parents. The first, the first is how to think, and the second is how to speak, neither of which I learned in a lecture theatre. You might reasonably feel that these sound like relatively basic skills, ones which you might expect someone to have gained before attending a third-level institution, but I would contend that they are actually quite rare. I think that most people don't start to begin to get a proper grasp on these skills until they reach university or until they have some other form of significant life experience, because these skills are frequently undervalued in our education system and in our society more broadly. Discourse, in its true sense, is fundamentally an honest exchange of ideas, often with the aim of persuading someone of a belief, though this does not always have to be the case. It is through this process, I feel, that people truly learn to think and to speak, which is fundamentally important to how we live our lives and to how we improve them for the better. We live in a world that is faced with unprecedented global issues, which affect everyone on the planet, although not entirely equally. These issues do, though, threaten all of our existence, and they do so in the immediate future. These issues continuously fail to be addressed and treated with the respect and significance that they desperately need. Our planet, the home of ourselves and the animals we share it with, is being burned and flooded and choked with toxic gas and generally being rendered uninhabitable in a myriad of different ways. Our societies often still consider the rights of others to be optional, something which can be put to the side in the face of mild inconvenience to themselves. Our resources to solve these problems are often held by a very small group of people to be dispensed as they see for their own benefit, too quickly excused for making small gestures which temporarily address problems that they themselves have helped to cause. So many people end up being left behind and forgotten, their struggles and survival discarded in favor of a slightly eased conscience. It is my belief that to a large extent these problems can be attributed to a reluctance for people to think deeply about the world, a tendency to accept what they've been told, and an unwillingness to interact with ideas that may challenge them, all in the interests of generally making their own lives a little bit easier. It goes hand in hand with a general negligence of the value of discourse, where people become trapped in bubbles on both sides of any given divide, their preference for seeking out agreeable views to their own, amplified tremendously by the recommendation algorithms of large technology companies who have been given a seldom regulated monopoly on information and communication, and their unwillingness to examine things from perspectives that are not their own is restricting them from ever making a difference and persuading someone else to change their mind. I do not know how people can think that they might be able to affect change if they are not willing to converse in good faith with someone whose views might differ to their own, and if they are not willing to fully listen to that person's perspective to understand their point of view. If people do not change, I do not know how you could think that anything else in the world might. People are very complex. Their thought processes are made up of millions upon millions of interwoven experiences, the combination of which form their unique understanding of the world around them. Even if you cannot understand how they came to a decision, even if it is completely unfathomable to you that someone might be able to think a certain way about an issue, there is a process by which they came to that opinion, and it is this process which drives their actions. I am of the opinion that nature simply provides most of us a nudge as individuals, but otherwise has a relatively limited impact on who we end up becoming, and that the majority of ourselves can more be described to nurture or realistically experience. A portion of that may be driven by how people respond to our nature, but moving someone to a completely different context, I believe, will fundamentally change their perspective on almost everything. I find many of the commonly held conservative views in America deeply offensive, and struggle to understand how someone can view other people in such ways. However, if I was born in the Deep South to conservative parents and was forced to attend a school with a conservative ethos, I don't think that I can confidently say that I would not hold these same views. I would like to think that some part of myself would persevere, that it would drive me to reject those views in favor of the clear moral good, but without actually having had those experiences or understanding what it was like to have had those experiences, I find it difficult to be sure. What I do feel this means, however, is that people are inherently susceptible to being persuaded by others or by their own direct experience, once that persuasion engages with how they form their opinions and how they view the world. But this will never happen if we continue down this road of hard divisions and ridiculing opinions. It might not happen in some cases regardless. I'm not trying to persuade you that everyone is easily swayed and that you can remove some of the most entrenched views that some people hold. But it is certain that you will not reach people if you choose not to engage with them. The sad truth is that there are cases where people are so fiercely indoctrinated into a belief that even if it doesn't align with their reality or their needs or their goals, they will hold it anyways because of the magnitude of the pressure that is being placed on them. One such case of this is gay individuals with deeply ingrained internalized homophobia as a product of how they and other gay individuals they knew had been treated when they were growing up, which is something that was especially common in Ireland in the not-too-distant past. For these individuals, they have no innate desire to hold these beliefs, and in fact are the most likely to be predisposed not to hold them. However, being assailed from all sides with a narrative can root it firmly in your mind regardless of this, especially when it's being repeated by everybody you know, when it's being repeated by those you look up to and those you learn from. The only way someone in that position is able to be helped towards a view that does more align with their own reality, their own desires, and their own needs is by being willing to listen to their experience in the first place and try to discuss them honestly. This is obviously one particularly extreme case, but I think that there are several more of differing extremities that are equally as applicable. Importantly, though, another way in which discourse affects us all, aside from trying to persuade the minds of others or change their beliefs to effect change, is also through our own assumptions. Challenging your own assumptions by respectfully debating with others, I feel, is crucial to your own development as a person. Your ability to think and to create are constrained by the experiences that you yourself have had, the language that you know, and the assumptions which you fundamentally believe. There are some experiences you will never realistically be able to access, for good or for worse. However, you can often achieve a reasonable approximation of them by listening to others and hearing how they have come to their own conclusions. Having this input forms a broader base for your own thoughts. But having people with these different contexts challenge your beliefs is the most effective way to root out your own false assumptions, discarding them in favor of slightly more nuanced perspectives, which consider more holistically how other people might react to a situation and the decisions that they have made. We often formulate our ideas for the future based on what has happened in the past and what is currently happening right now, without stopping to necessarily consider whether our assumptions about these events are correct and whether or not these events were either good or bad, or perhaps somewhere in the middle. This has very, very wide-reaching implications, from the prejudices that people hold to designing solutions to social problems, and also the considerations when doing something like constructing a new building or inventing a new product. Frequently, there are whole swathes of people who are denied opportunities, such as people with physical mobility issues being unable to navigate a building that was not designed with universal access in mind, or when policies address assumptions about groups rather than the underlying issues, with criminal justice being a prime example of where there's an assumption that people choose to commit a crime, when the reality is probably more of a spectrum between necessity and choice, where many people are dotted at various points throughout. Empathy fundamentally involves an understanding of someone's thoughts and feelings beyond the surface level observations of someone being happy or someone being sad and feeling sympathy or other emotions towards them as a result. And it is only when you engage intensely with someone's thoughts and experiences in a manner where each of you put forward your own ideas with their assumptions that you truly begin to understand somebody else. Empathy, I feel, is a crucial building block towards building meaningful improvements right across society, because it means that people begin to better consider the impact of their actions on others, and because it means that people are more likely to advocate for change which is meaningful to others as well as to just themselves when they understand what others need as well. I think this is notably different from things such as contact theory, which I do not necessarily believe in particularly as being a particularly effective means of causing change, where presence does indeed obviously help with normalization. Depending on the context it occurs in and the lens through which it is viewed, it can equally enforce negative norms as much as positive ones. However, engaging in discourse necessitates a more involved and a deeper form of communication, which is more likely to provide actual mutual understanding and hopefully build a bridge to something better in the near future. I feel as well that the impact of being able to persuade people and to discuss in this way is immense. There is an old saying that the pen is mightier than the sword. And while I don't think that you should necessarily fight someone wielding a sword with a pen, I do think that there is a lot of truth to the meaning behind this phrase, in the sense that being able to write to convince someone, or in this case, being able to debate with someone, is likely to have far more widely reaching impacts than your own direct actions. If I pick up some litter that I found on the street, that is undeniably helpful to the environment. It is removing another piece of pollution, something that an animal might choke on or might get sent to landfill and contribute to a growing problem. However, it is not going to be nearly as effective as the potential to convince a large swathe of people to take similar actions throughout their lives at different points, in which case you actually begin to affect real change. And I think this happens even more so than in writing in discourse, where people have the chance to respond. Because when people disagree with you and you are able to engage with the reasons why they disagree, you are often much more likely in the first place to try and be able to convince them, but also to potentially improve your own ideas and solutions as well, as opposed to when you write something down and people disagree with it, but they do so silently and they do so by themselves. I think that most of these problems that I've talked about can only ever be dealt with by teaching people as a whole to engage in discourse with each other. I don't think this process necessarily works when only one or two people engage in discourse. That is certainly a way it can start. I think it works when people in general are taught that this is something valuable, when schools teach that these are skills that people need to use, and when people actively put them into practice in the real world every day. I think only when people on a mass scale decide to actually reconsider the truth of their assumptions, their beliefs, and their reality, to listen to the thoughts of others, and to engage in good faith discussions on both sides of conflicts, in all conflicts, will we ever start to achieve the level of cohesive action required to effect meaningful change on a large scale. And the day is rapidly approaching where it will be too late for any actions that we take to have meaningful consequences on the survivability of our current circumstances. So I would say that for these reasons, not just is discourse deeply important in the modern day, but I think that there are a few things that could be legitimately considered as more important than discourse when you consider these challenges that we face. Thank you.
Perhaps the House will forgive me if I just say a few words of introduction to Mr. Keenan. We are very honoured and delighted that he's here. And he is so appropriate in so many different ways, because there are at least two very strong links between this society and Mr. Keenan. In 1770, a man called Carney, Dr. Carney, senior fellow of the college, proposed to the board of the college that the College Historical Society should be formed, and that a group of students should be allowed to meet, as they did, in the dining hall to form a student debating society. Dr. Carney was, in fact, I think, the 12th great uncle of Barack Obama. The second connection is 200 years later, to the month really, when Ted Kennedy Senator Kennedy came to Trinity and spoke at the 200th anniversary of the Hist in the examination hall over there, and gave a truly splendid address, absolutely wonderful address. And it's written up in the history of the society, which I've given to Mr. Keenan. But I'll just take a couple of things from it for you to give you some impression of the connection that he made, that Senator Kennedy made with the society. We chose him to come here and give the keynote address to the society celebrating its 200th anniversary. He was very kind to us, first of all, because he said, and I quote, "The Hist is the greatest of all the schools of orators." There was a compliment. He extolled peace, controversy, discussion, discourse, reformation, not revolution. He identified, quote, "the two greatest dangers to the future of mankind: the continuation of oppression all over the world, and the tolerance of weapons that can destroy our planet." Were he speaking today, I know he would talk about the challenges of climate change, and possibly one or two other things. But he spoke most brilliantly about these things. For some strange reason, I was in charge of security that day. I had spotted some people around the room, former rugby players mostly, over there in the exam hall, and one of my old friends was up in the gallery near the organ, and a Maoist student stood up and shouted at Kennedy, "Down with US imperialism, the greatest enemy the Western world has ever known." My friend was sitting very close to him, and in the last few words of this shout, there was the sound of him being throttled as he was carried out. And Kennedy said, "There goes one of the great orators." Absolutely wonderful. However, today we have this really strong link with Mr. Keenan. Obviously, you know, because of his important, great role as speechwriter to Obama, but also because he started, as it were, his career as a political advisor and participant at the highest level in American politics as an advisor to Senator Ted Kennedy. So what a connection for us to have. He's a graduate of Northwestern University, where he studied politics. He went to the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard for a postgraduate degree in policy making, and while he was taking that degree at Harvard, he became an intern in the Obama campaign, I think, in 2007. And when he graduated, joined the campaign full-time. Went on to become the deputy speechwriter, first of all in the White House, and then the main speechwriter in the White House. One of the speeches that he drafted was the State of the Union message in 2013. The man you are going to hear tonight was at the center of government, was one of the closest colleagues of President Obama. And we will all remember, those of us who heard him, and I think probably all of you did, but maybe some of you were younger than maybe you were able to appreciate, but you've heard him speak. That man, President Obama, one of the reasons he was elected was that he was one of the great orators. And it worries me greatly, of course, that sometimes the great orators are the bad people. Just think of that for a second. Think of Johnson in the UK. Think of Trump in the US. You may not like their styles of oratory, but they have enormous power of public speaking. At that time, the greatest orator was Obama. And Cody Keenan was a person who contributed enormously to that. So we are very, very, very pleased, Mr. Keenan, that you will address the audience now.
I rise in opposition to discourse. Just kidding. I just wanted to do that. That was extraordinary. Thank you very much. I actually didn't know either of those stories. So if I did, I would have put the first story in the College Green speech 12 years ago. I'm an unlikely choice for this because I'm not a good debater. I don't enjoy thinking on my feet. I don't enjoy being quick. I enjoy being a writer and taking my time. I enjoy the pain of trying to find the right words and find the right arguments for a speech. But it's still an important part of discourse. And the tack I'll take today is, you know, as a debating society, you often take two sides of one issue and leave it at that. But I'd argue, you know, while you're thinking and arguing with facts and logic and reason, never forget the importance of story, a good story. I'm going to tell you one today, and it's obviously been foremost on my mind because I am here in Ireland on a book tour. A book called Grace, President Obama in 10 Days in the Battle for America. It's #1 at Hodges Figgis, no big deal. There are signed copies at Hodges Figgis and Dubray and chapters of books upstairs. I decided to write a book after I left the White House. I stayed with President Obama for 4 more years and helped him with his memoirs. And I decided I didn't want to write a memoir. #1, because I feel like I'm too young. I haven't earned it yet. I don't have enough of a story to tell. #2, the fact that I helped him with his memoirs meant that mine would be in the sales dumpster coming out on the heels of his. So I decided to write a book about 10 days in June 2015. And a lot of the things that happen in this book are uniquely American in that you don't have to worry about this stuff over here. It might sound foreign. The 10 days began with a mass shooting in Charleston, South Carolina, carried out by a self-radicalized white supremacist who took an assault weapon into a black church and murdered 8 parishioners and their pastor during Bible study. And when he was caught, he said it was because he wanted to start a race war, which immediately puts us on high alert that there could be all sorts of recrimination afterwards and maybe more violence. And over the course of the week, we had to decide whether or not President Obama was going to give a eulogy. He didn't want to. I didn't want to write it. And it's because we had done so many after mass shootings. You know, to talk about a way that America is truly exceptional, it is our obsession with gun violence. And over the course of the week, we're also preparing for 2 Supreme Court cases that we know are going to come down. We just don't know what day, and we don't know how they're going to be decided. One is on Obamacare, another thing that a country with universal health insurance doesn't have to worry about. This was our health care initiative. And the Supreme Court was basically going to decide whether or not it stayed intact or not. And there was a real chance that 20 million Americans would lose their health insurance overnight. We're also deciding on marriage equality, which you guys beat us to the punch on. But there's a real chance the Supreme Court's going to say to millions of Americans, you can't get married like the rest of us, you're second-class citizens. And all of these things are swirling together at the exact same time. And I'm, of course, panicking over all of them. You know, when we had a very passionate debate in the Oval Office about whether or not to give a eulogy, and again, neither I or the president wanted to, he said, we have run out of words. We have nothing left to say on this. And then Josh Earnest, the press secretary, reminded him of something that had happened a couple days earlier, 2 days after the shooting. All of the family members of the victims, people who had lost their, not just lost, people whose parents and grandparents and children were stolen from them 2 days before, stood up one by one in court and through their tears, through their wails, forgave the killer. And it was, I had never seen anything like it. It wasn't something my faith had ever taught me to do. It was just beyond my comprehension. It was an act of grace. And that just goes to show you that debates are not just won with logic and reason and facts. They are won by gestures. They are won by actions. They're sometimes won even by being quiet. And I was talking to a Republican congressman from the South. Well, first of all, what was so extraordinary about what they did too was it tamped down any idea that there would be more recriminations. It just kind of cooled tensions immediately. And one thing we never thought we'd see in the days after that was Republican governors across the South started quietly lowering the Confederate flags over the state houses for good. They shouldn't have been flying there in the first place, but they were. And I remember a congressman from the South, a Republican, told me in the days after, he said, listen, you need to understand how important it was what those families did. If Barack Obama had told us to take down the Confederate flag, if he had badgered us with facts and logic and reason, we would not have done it. But what those families did made it impossible for us to keep it up. And I remember talking with President Obama in the Oval Office when we were deciding whether or not to give this eulogy. He said, look, man, he almost joked. He went on a rant about the Confederate flag, because as a black man, he's got some personal feelings about it. I left most of that out of the book, because most of it was profane. But he said, look, man, when we came into office, I had a to-do list about 200 items long. And taking down the Confederate flag was not on it, because I knew that wasn't going to happen. And it just happened like that. So meanwhile, I'm trying to put together all these speeches. You know, he said, listen, I still don't want to give this eulogy. I've agreed to go do it because of what these families did. So just go get started. I want you to write about race, write about guns, write about the Confederate flag, and tie it all up in this concept of grace. And I looked at him and said, oh, is that all? The 3 topics that maybe make Americans angrier and more divided than any other: guns, race, Confederate flag. I need you to go write a eulogy about those things. And I struggled my way through it. I've always struggled about writing about race as a white man, you know, knowing exactly who I am and how badly I want to get this right. And we had to write multiple speeches for each Supreme Court decision, win or lose, because you can't leave the country waiting. So I had to write speeches too, and my team, on what happens. What does Barack Obama say to the American people if 20 million of them just lost their health insurance? What does he say to millions of gay Americans who've just been told, you can't get married like the rest of us? And the one thing we kept coming back to was, what is the story that we tell about ourselves as a country, both here and around the world? And are we living up to that story? What does it mean to be an American, you know, at our best, if we're actually living up to our best? And it means trying to close that gap between the lofty ideals of our founding and the realities of our time. Each generation doing that work. And so I tried to actually tie all those remarks together, even though we didn't know which way the Supreme Court cases were going. Fortunately, on day 9 of the book, not to give away too many spoilers, We won the healthcare case, which was great. That lifted a lot of pressure on us. On day 10, the Supreme Court found a right to marriage equality, and it was just jubilant scenes at the Supreme Court, jubilant scenes in the office, because we had a whole bunch of LGBT colleagues who just breathed a sigh of relief, and young people who couldn't fathom the Supreme Court saying no, all breathing a sigh of relief. I had not yet breathed a sigh of relief because the eulogy wasn't finished. And I had given Barack Obama a draft the night before that I knew wasn't up to snuff. I had worked on it for 3 days, including 2 all-nighters. And he went and worked on it for 3 hours and then called me back to the residence at midnight. And he said, look, this is well written, but, which is never a good sign. That's just his way of being nice. He had made heavy edits to the first 2 pages, and on the last 2 pages, he had just drawn one big line through each. And he had completely written them longhand in 3 hours. And I felt terrible about myself. You know, for the first time I apologized to him. I felt like I'd truly let him down. And he said, no, brother, look, we are collaborators. You gave me what I needed to work with here. And when you've been thinking about this stuff for 40 years, you'll know what you want to say too. And he was right. And he had taken this beautiful tack of redoing the structure around the lyrics to Amazing Grace, which was so simple, and I was so angry at myself for not thinking of it. So the final morning, he goes out and speaks on marriage equality, and we tied those remarks together about not just what it means to be an American, but how long progress takes. And that this victory wasn't something that was achieved right away. The healthcare victory was achieved by 100 years of a universal healthcare movement, even though we're not finished. The marriage equality victory was the result of 50 years of an LGBTQ movement where people bled and died for other people to be freer. And then we were still mindful that we had to go eulogize someone who was a victim of white supremacist hatred. And so we get on the helicopter and we take off for Andrews Air Force Base. This is 5 minutes after his speech. He's still working on the remarks, and he hands them back to me, and he goes, you know, if it feels right, I might sing it, which also hadn't occurred to me. And he takes the step, not just of, in this eulogy that we knew people around the world would be watching, not just of telling people why we need to do something about guns, why the Confederate flag should come down, how to win on race relations, but by taking the leap of faith that a president of the United States singing in front of the entire world might help soften hearts, beyond also just changing minds. And I remember the letters that poured in after that speech. One will always stand out from someone who said he was a racist, and he had used the N-word, and he had lawn jockeys, and he said, I have never considered how wrong I was until right now, because of that gesture. And we returned home that night to a White House that was lit up in all the colors of the rainbow, another powerful gesture that we would have done even had we lost, because it would have been even more important. So the point here is, as you engage in discourse, as you go forth into the world and debate, never forget too about the power of story, making people believe they're part of something bigger, even recasting the story of a country and a movement. And never forget about emotion, never forget about gesture, never forget about symbolism. All of these things are important and powerful too. And then one last thing that's not related to discourse, because I love speaking to young people, my last piece of advice to you is find a collaborator as you go forth. You can't change the world alone. Don't be so eager to move on from this wonderful place that you leave it all behind. People ask me all the time what I miss about the White House. It's not the trappings of power. It's not Air Force One, as awesome as that is. It's having a collaborator in Barack Obama that I worked with every day, collaborators on my speechwriting team, and a whole little army of young people that I've been working with at that point for 10 years. The day you leave office, you scatter to the winds, and you don't always get it back. So find your team of collaborators now. Find people who are not just like-minded, but passionate about the same thing, who want to change the world the way you do, because it is difficult, it is frustrating. You are never going to get everything you want. You will never get 100%. But if you can get a little bit piece by piece and keep making the world better, there really is joy to be found in that struggle. That's what makes democracy so hard and frustrating. So build a little army of idealistic Avengers around you who care about the same thing you do, and go get to work. Hold on, what else was to say? The thanks of the society are due to the auditor for their address. Thank you very much.
We We are very privileged. I think we all agree. So the thanks of the Society are due to the Auditor for his address. Would you please pass that by applause? Now it is my very great pleasure to invite Dr. Rory Montgomery to address you. A member of the Society, officer in the Society in the late 1970s, he has gone on to have a really, really distinguished career in the Department of Foreign Affairs. He became our permanent representative to the European Union. He became our ambassador to Paris. He returned to become as Secretary General in the department with responsible for EU issues, and we all know how important those are and how complicated they are. He was a member of the team in the Department of Affairs which negotiated the Good Friday Agreement. After this really, really distinguished career in our Department of Foreign Affairs, and I just want to remind you of the enormous quality of the staff of our Department of Foreign Affairs, which have batted far beyond their weight, representing us in Brussels, of course, representing us across the world, especially our relations, of course, with the United States, which are so important to us, and, by the way, representing us in these crucial negotiations with Britain as we have moved forward in resolving issues in the north of Ireland. The quality and power and strength, wisdom of our Department of Foreign Affairs is actually legendary across that discipline, as it were, across Europe. Since he has retired, he has been devoting himself to many different projects. He is an honorary fellow of the college with close connections with the Trinity Long Room Hub. He has very close associations with Queen's University Belfast. He has recently been elected a member of the Royal Irish Academy. So it's with enormous pleasure that I ask Dr. Rory Montgomery to address you.
President, Auditor, ladies and gentlemen of the College Historical Society, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very grateful to the President for his extraordinarily kind words. It is proof, of course, that you can't believe everything you hear in a speech, because much as I wish I were Dr. Rory Montgomery.
Just a few more papers.
But there are quite something to be following Cody Keenan, because I think he obviously has thought deeply about oratory, about debate, about discourse. But of course he had a rather good collaborator to work with. I would have written a lot of speeches in my own time in the Department of Foreign Affairs. We used to believe that possibly our speeches were generally better than those from other government departments for their ministers, which wasn't saying a heck of a lot. There were sort of many Irish sort of civil service speeches, and I have to say we never had the luxury of spending 3 days on a speech or otherwise, because very often the people writing the speeches were people making the policy and doing everything else. But there were five features I came to wish to avoid in speeches I was involved with. I mean, the first would be that the minister would stand up and say, "I'm very glad to be here tonight at the County Wicklow Beekeepers Club." Your club was founded in 1936. In other words, telling them what they knew better than he did. The second thing to avoid would be a lengthy list of facts. I'll come back in a second to this whole issue of facts and logical argument and emotion, which both the auditor and Cody have spoken about. But long strings of facts do not really convince anybody. Another important thing to do is to avoid quoting Yeats or Seamus Heaney unless you really know what you're talking about and can come up with an original quotation from Yeats or Heaney, not so easy. The President, US President, President Biden, is rather keen on Heaney, and I have no doubt that he is indeed an enthusiastic fan of Heaney. But as I say, once you have heard, more than once about hope and history rhyming, well, more than 10 times, you begin to think, well, maybe it's time to retire. On the other hand, coming up with new quotations is not always easy. I once put into a speech, or in a draft speech for the Minister for Foreign Affairs at the time, Dick Spring, a quotation from the Anglo-Irish novelist Elizabeth Bowen, and she compared the relationship. She said that the relationship between England and Ireland was a mixture of showing off and suspicion, almost as bad as sex. My boss, who was tweaking the speech, mysteriously added in a strange mixture of pleasure and pain, which made all of his colleagues wonder about him. Those things to avoid. I'm really pleased to be here. I remember very well the last time I was at a Hist event was pretty well exactly 3 years ago, just a little over 3 years ago, when the Society was celebrating its 250th anniversary, 50 years after Senator Kennedy came. And I do remember there was a series of events. I spoke with one of them, and it all ended with a great dinner in the dining hall, which the President spoke most eloquently at. We had a wonderful poem in honour of the Society. And then more or less immediately afterwards, the shutters came down with COVID, and it was for a very long time the last social event I had attended. So it's great to be back, and I don't know, those of you who kept the Society going during lockdown and during this terrible time in the university when people were not physically meeting each other, I really think you're owed a tremendous vote of thanks from everybody, and it's great that you are back functioning in real time and in each other's actual presence. I want to say just a very few words about the importance of debate and discourse, and much of what I have to say really echoes both what the Auditor said in his excellent address and what Cody said. And then at the end I want to touch very briefly on a particular issue where I think debate is important and will be important, above all for your generation in the decades ahead. I suppose I'm a pretty classic mid-19th century liberal. I believe passionately in free speech. I believe in the right of people to say not perhaps everything they want to say, but most of what they want to say. I would quote the great American writer, thinker, orator, and abolitionist Frederick Douglass, who said that liberty is meaningless where the right to utter one's thoughts and opinions has ceased to exist. And that of all rights is the dread of tyrants. It's the right which they first of all strike down. And again, to echo what the Auditor said, debate and discourse can have an effect both on the speaker, but also on the listener. Again, to quote John Stuart Mill, another great 19th century liberal, he who knows only his own side of the case knows little of it. His reasons may be good, nobody may be able to refute them, but if he's equally unable to refute the reasons on the opposite side, if he does not so much as know what they are, he has no ground for preferring either opinion. So in other words, if you listen to people who hold contrary views to yours, either you change your mind, or you understand better why you hold the views that you do. The second point is, of course, that it's not just the right to speak, it's a right to hear and a right to listen. And again, as Mill said, in his way, the peculiar evil of silencing the expression of an opinion is that it is robbing the human race. Those who dissent from the opinion still more than those who hold it. And people have a right to listen and to hear. And likewise, Douglass said something similar. The right to hear. To suppress free speech is a double wrong. It violates the rights of the hearer as well as those of the speaker. Now, am I saying that the right to free speech is absolute? No, it's not. mean, very famously, there was an American judge who talked about the fact that there was no right to shout fire in a crowded theatre. Equally, there are some things which people say which are so obnoxious, evidently false, that they are beyond the bounds of civilized society, if you like. For example, Holocaust denial, incitement to hatred, gross expressions of racism or otherwise. But I think at the same time, we need to be very careful that we limit to the minimum the restrictions we place on freedom of speech. Infringement on free speech does weaken liberty. As I say, Mill was recognised the concept of harm. Say incitement to violence or hatred clearly can bring about harm. But at the same time, I don't think that hurting the feelings of your audience represents harm. I don't think that advancing a controversial opinion represents harm. America is in many ways a leader, and one of the ways it's a leader is that there have been, as far as we can tell, there have been threats to freedom of speech, particularly in universities, from two sides of the argument. You have those who engage in no platforming, cancel culture, and so on, and in a way which is really aimed at limiting what other people will hear, denying the opportunities mentioned and supported by Mill and Douglas. And I really think, Ireland, fortunately, has not got to that point in particular, but I do think it's essential, and I, just as a footnote, I was disappointed, I'll say, just to learn that members of this society or teams of this society have not taken part in the last 2 years in the Irish Times University debate because of disputes with the Irish Times over its handling of trans rights. Whatever you may feel, and you may feel very strongly about those rights, who are you benefiting by not speaking at an event organised by and funded by this newspaper? But that's neither here nor there. I believe this was a very contentious matter in the society. I shouldn't be engaging in it, no doubt, but I just thought that I would say what I felt, because I was a judge at the Irish Times debate semi-final. There was an individual speaker from the Hist there. She was sitting up there, but she seems to have vanished, an American speaker from one of the Carolinas, I think. But she thought there's a team member. But on the other hand, of course, we'll see equally tremendous pressure on rights to freedom of expression, both in written form, in education, and otherwise, from the cultural right. And it's really distressing and disappointing to see that one of the leading candidates for the Republican nomination for president, Governor DeSantis of Florida, is spearheading this effort to deny people access to books which might broaden their minds, and is essentially trying to prevent teachers from talking about things which their students might usefully need to hear. Now, as I say, I don't know that where the United States goes, Ireland necessarily follows. I hope, in this respect and in some others, I hope not, great admirer as I am of the United States. But there are, of course, there are in a way, and this sort of follows on from what both the auditor and Cody were saying. In Aristotle's basic principles of rhetoric, 3 essential elements: logos, which is the word, which is facts, language, rhetoric, logic; pathos, which is about emotion and sympathy, storytelling, if you like; and also not to be forgotten, ethos, which is about the speaker's authority and credibility. And I think in a way, in all of these ways, all of these things are being challenged to an extent in the modern era. We do have, of course, and technology has undoubtedly had this effect, has exacerbated the effect. There can be disinformation can be spread in the blink of an eye on a massive scale. People don't know very often that what they're reading is fake. And even if what they're reading isn't fake, there's just an avalanche of facts coming on people that it's extraordinarily difficult to know what to believe or what not to believe. That's always been the case, but it's a particular problem now, I would say. Secondly, I would say that in terms of pathos, again, the real importance of stories was mentioned by Cody very rightly. And I don't know, again, during our own referendums recently on abortion and marriage equality, I think the general view would be that one of the crucial elements in convincing especially older people and more religious people to vote in favour were stories. Stories about people's children and grandchildren, stories about stories from women who had, who had suffered from the absence of abortion rights and so forth. So those stories, I think, were decisively important. Probably would have passed anyway, but I think there was a sense overall that this society, but pathos is really important, but at the same time, of course, appealing to people's emotions without facts, it can be extraordinarily dangerous as well. And some of the great orators, absolutely, have been people who have used and manipulated emotions for the sake of, for evil purposes. And then, of course, when it comes to ethos, it's commonly said that, people do not respect experts. There is little faith in institutions of society. There's little faith in politicians. There's less faith in journalists. I think scientists are well respected. I think there are some other professions which are well respected. Not lawyers, I'm afraid, for any of you here who may be law students. But I think it's a really important point, and it's a real difficulty. As well, another point I'd make is this, that again, it's a consequence of social media, ever-shortening attention spans. That people, the idea, I doubt if things back in the heyday of formal public debate were ever quite as remarkable as we read. But the great debates between Abraham Lincoln and his opponent in the Illinois Senate race, Stephen Douglas, those were fantastically well-written, well-composed, lengthy arguments. It used to be the case that in the better British newspapers, even in our own Irish Times, debates in the Dáil would be actually reported and carried at length. Not the case anymore. So what you have increasingly are sound bites. People remember gaffes. They remember one-liners, as I said. They remember how people looked. And that can work to the advantage of the good guys, but not always. And again, that, in my view, puts great pressure on discourse. I did say I was going to just mention one particular issue very quickly, and I'm going to take the liberty of abusing my position in some respect. One of the things I've worked on, the President said that I had worked on the Good Friday Agreement back in the day, and one of the things I'm very involved with at the moment is a joint project of the Royal Irish Academy and the University of Notre Dame about the future of the island of Ireland, if you like. It's an academic project, but we try to publicise it as much as we can. And it came to notice recently when with the Irish Times, it co-funded a whole series of opinion polls about attitudes north and south to unity and so on. I think, essentially, one element of the polls which really gave people thought was the lack of knowledge and preparedness in the Republic for any kind of discussion about a united Ireland. People were asked, well, would you be prepared to change your flag? Large majority, no. Would you be prepared to change your anthem? No. Would you be prepared to think of joining the Commonwealth as a gesture of confidence to the oaths of a unionist British tradition? Absolutely not. Would you be prepared to see a continuation of specific institutional arrangements within Northern Ireland in the United Ireland? My God, why on earth would we have that, Sure, aren't they joining us, being the line? And I think in many of the focus groups and so on, what was really striking, that these views were not the result of any particular reflection or debate. I'm not saying it would be illegitimate to be opposed to the change of an anthem, whatever effect it might have otherwise. But I am saying that at a minimum, people ought to have thought about these things. And over the years and decades ahead, as the question of possible Irish unity becomes more and more prominent, it is your generation which will be at the centre of debate and discussion. So I suppose what I mean is that people should be open to a proper, well-informed debate about these questions, that people in the Republic who always say in great numbers that they're in favour of Ireland, it's their obligation to inform themselves, to engage in open and respectful discussion. People such as yourselves, who've had the great privilege of studying at Trinity College, at being members of the society, I think you have a particular responsibility to listen to others, to participate in debate, and to lead debate over the time ahead. Thank you very much. I want to propose a motion, and you can carry on clapping after I say it. I want to propose the motion to propose that the College Historical Society is worthy of support.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've had a really, truly wonderful discussion of the importance of discourse, and I think it is so valuable that Mr. Montgomery has drawn your attention to the fact that you are going to be taking part over the next 20 to 30 years in this momentous question. Are we going to unite with the people of the north of Ireland? And when I was a student here, a long time ago, BC, 1/3 of the students in Trinity came from the north of Ireland, and they were almost entirely Protestant. 1/3 of the students came from the Republic, who were mostly Protestant too, because the Catholic Archbishop of Dublin would not allow Catholics, on pain of committing mortal sin, I mean mortal sin, they were not allowed to come to Trinity. And 1/3 of the students came from the UK, of whom about a half were Catholic, but they didn't know anything about the Catholic Archbishop of Dublin. The point I'm coming to simply is this, that for those of us who are not from the north of Ireland, we met Unionists, and they were very prominent in this society, by the way. And in the discourse that is going to come, one of the most important things for us all in the Republic is that we get to know the people from the north. And that may mean a very, very serious set of organised exchanges of views between your generation from the south and those from the north, both Unionists and Republicans. And it is, in my own view, only through that kind of very personal exchange that we can actually move from this rigid rejection of any moves concerning the nature of the Republic of Ireland and the kind of state which I hope we are able to form, which I do hope will happen over the next 20 to 30 years. I think, by the way, that it is a great mistake to rush it. This is something we've got to work very closely, very slowly, with great understanding. I have ancestors from the north, quite a large set of people living there. I hardly know them. It's only in the last, just before COVID, 4 years ago, that I went to visit my ancestral home on the shores of Lough Neagh. Protestant, Presbyterian families. Most people have no idea what a Presbyterian is. Not a clue. You wouldn't, for example, know that Presbyterians from the north, the so-called Scots-Irish, played a huge role in the development of the ideas which gave rise to the American Revolution. None of you, I can almost guarantee, would know that Princeton University, one of the top 10 universities in the world, was founded by Presbyterians. And that the head, the president of that university, it wasn't called Princeton in those days, I think it was called the Presbyterian College or something of that kind. I forget his name. He was a Scot, and in very lengthy discourses and sermons and pamphlets laid out the arguments why a people were entitled to revolt. He gave the moral and ethical justification for the revolution, essentially following John Locke and others. But it was coming out of something that you will, I think, hardly have ever, you won't have heard of it, You will not associate the word Presbyterian with Republican, nor will you associate the word Presbyterian with Democrat. You will think of Paisley and so on. The fact is that Presbyterian congregations elect their ministers, elect their priests, and are able to fire them. Now imagine that in a Catholic church in Ireland. So when you are dealing with Presbyterians from the north of Ireland, you are dealing with people who have hundreds of years of commitment to democracy. When I was a kid in Dublin as a Presbyterian, I left it fairly quickly, by the way, because I'm not mad keen on these sorts of things. I went to Sunday school on a Sunday morning before going to Presbyterian service. Why did the Presbyterians have a thing called Sunday school? Because the ministers knew it was a good idea to try to teach the members of their congregation so that when it came to controversy within the congregation, there would be an informed discussion. That was long before universal education. This goes back to the 1500s and 1600s in Scotland mainly, and then coming to Ireland. So, we have an awful lot to learn about the people of the north of Ireland. An awful lot to learn. And I really, of course, I think we should all be enormously grateful to Rory Montgomery and his colleagues in Notre Dame and in the Royal Irish Academy for developing these sorts of ideas. So, a few thoughts. I think, Auditor, you have chosen the most wonderful subject for your inaugural. Nothing could be more important than discourse, and it is up to you now, as the coming generation, to take part, to lead in the discourses, not just on our domestic things, the future of Ireland, but the future of our planet. How are we going to deal with, as I was talking to Cody Keenan earlier, how are we going to get rid of capitalism? Have you ever heard the word growth in a political discourse? How people are promoting growth here, we've got to grow, we're going to have the best program for growth. You all know that can't go on. We actually can't commit ourselves politically to continue growth. And there's a lovely book which I was recommending to Cody Keenan. I think it's entitled The End of Growth. There's a very serious discussion amongst economists and political scientists on the end of growth. But this book starts with a wonderful evocation of the ideas of Robert Kennedy when he was beginning his run for the presidency. I was in Los Angeles at the time, and he was starting his campaign, I think, in either Oklahoma City or Kansas City, and he gave this extraordinary presentation on how this American commitment to essentially growth, even then, in the 1960s, that this was not actually going to be possible. It could not continue. That's 60 years ago. Growth could not be our long-term objective. Absolutely extraordinary. A few days later, I was in Los Angeles, so was he, and he was assassinated. But the description of Kennedy and the importance of his ideas, I think, need to be looked at. It's lovely to see them in this book. Now, there is one last thing. I know that the treasurer and the auditor would like me. I'm not sure who's going to say something about Cody Keenan and to thank him tonight.
So you might have noticed a theme tonight. It's firstly because there is a theme, but that theme was chosen because our chief aim as a society is to foster and promote discourse and debate and to recognise those who do the same on the world stage. In that vein, over the last 250 years, we have welcomed a huge number of luminaries who have made outstanding contributions to their respective fields, including people like Margaret Atwood, President Michael D. Higgins, Archbishop Desmond Tutu. In that vein, it is my distinct honour to offer Mr. Cody Keenan our highest award, which is the Gold Medal for Outstanding Contributions to Public Discourse.
already spoke, but I'll just very briefly say I know how the Irish feel about Americans coming over and talking about how Irish we are. So, but I will just say, when Patrick Keenan left here in the 1750s, before America even existed, with nothing, if you'd have told him that someday one of his ancestors would have come back here and you would just give him a piece of gold for free, they would have been really pissed off. But I'm very grateful, so thank you all very much.
And I think so to the other great attribute of our society, which is called fun. I think you are all invited to a reception.
Yes.
And is that downstairs or upstairs?
It will be downstairs. So yeah, there will be a drinks and snacks reception after, well, now that we've concluded, next door in the conversation room, which we're all welcome to attend. And I'd like to thank you all again for coming to the inaugural meeting. It's very special. This is our first large in-person one since before the pandemic. So a big thank you to everyone who came, and of course a massive thank you to all of our speakers this evening as well.